Byzantium. The eastern half of the Roman Empire endured for more than 1,000 years. After the Western Empire fell, torn apart by constant warfare, corruption, intrigue, and financial turmoil. The Byzantine civilization represented a multiplicity of cultures, molded into a harmonious, confident whole, a melting pot, characterized by a measure of social mobility, where ambition could take a man from the bottom segments of society and plunge him to the prestigious heights of bureaucratic function, including all of its trappings and influence. It was a combination of the mysterious and unfamiliar, yet with familiar ideals and social outcomes. It spanned over many centuries, from the ancient to the medieval age, with some of its aspects still present in the modern world. It was the natural successor to the old Roman Empire, and it on some part inspired the Italian Renaissance, yet held its own distinct identity. Byzantium was an industrial society, far cry from the mass industrialization of the 18th and 19th century, and by modern standards, the empire was a backwater, still reliant upon agriculture, with vast tracts of farmland ploughed by an army of peasants living in villages. Byzantine cities, although sophisticated for its age, lacked the comforts we enjoy today, with its squalid, winding, narrow streets, slum housing, and inhabitants often limited to 30,000. The only cities to surpass this number would have been the large urban centres such as Antioch and Alexandria. Constantinople was the largest, most prosperous and populated city, with its wide boulevards, grand churches, high walls, and impressive palaces. In comparison to the other medieval urban centres, Byzantium was both advanced and sophisticated, blessed with well-paid, highly educated cadre of officials, and an efficient central bureaucracy that oversaw state business and advised the emperor on matters of diplomacy and trade. Far from being a liberal society in the modern sense, and with no constitution and no formal checks and balances on the emperor's power, his position was acclaimed by the people, and he was crowned by the Patriarch of Constantinople. Byzantium did not suffer at the hands of a crazed despot. There was no Nero, no Stalin or Hitler. The few ambitious tyrants such as Andronicus Comnenus were swiftly overthrown. The Eastern Empire had learned the painful lessons of its Western neighbour. Dictators were unwelcome. Although Constantine displayed signs of megalomania, his iconoclastic beliefs secured the support of the Church. Like Henry VIII, he meant to purge the state religion of all heresies. Several attempts were made to remove him, each failed, and he remained in power until his death in 337. A widely held misconception is that anyone living in Byzantium referred to it as such. Because it was simply a separate half of the Roman Empire, the people we know as Byzantines thought themselves as fully Roman. Though the empire was severed into two halves, Roman identity remained intact, because the separation neatly fit the dividing line between a Latin West and Greek East. The Eastern Empire shed its Latin veil to transform into a fully Greek state. It became overwhelmingly Christian. Byzantine's longevity was unique. Most empires declined after a few centuries of prosperity, usually because of military defeats, natural disasters, and economic strife. The Byzantine Empire lasted for almost 1200 years. Although there were setbacks and failures, such as the tumultuous reign of Justinian and the plague that spread throughout the known world in the year 541, and his attempts to resecure the western half of the empire, and the constant struggles and battles with the Persian Empire. It was the rise of Diocletian, who seized the throne in 284, that saw the birth of the Eastern Empire. Dismissed as an undereducated misfit, he displayed political astuteness by appointing his friend Maximian as Emperor of the Western Empire. Diocletian expanded the bureaucracy and strengthened the army in the east and reigned for 21 years before retiring of his own accord. His rule marred by the persecution of Christians. The enlarged government bolstered imperial administration and reinforced the empire from within. The reforms helped the Eastern Empire sustain periods of uncertainty, far outlasting its floundering Western counterpart. A year after the abdication of Diocletian, the charismatic yet ruthless Constantine, the first seized power as a Western emperor in 306. Although he ruled both sides of the empire, the imperial apparatus was overseen by different units of bureaucrats and his sons, who ruled different portions of the empire after his death. His new city of Constantinople grew in both size and prestige. By the end of the 4th century, it was seen as the official state capital, and with the ascension of Constantine and his subsequent conversion, Christians enjoyed greater freedom to practice their religion. Soon, their numbers swelled, and Christianity became the predominant religion. The religion proved to be a cohesive force binding the empire together. And during the first 300 years, the Eastern Empire flourished. From the later 4th and early 5th century, it lost some of its territory to the Persians, Huns, and the Germans. And when Justinian rose to power, he built an array of structures, of which the greatest example is the Hagia Sophia. He also codified Roman law and invested heavily in education. And more impressively, Justinian reclaimed prominent parts of the Western Empire, wresting control from the Germans, taking back parts of Italy, Dalmatia, northern Africa, and southern Spain. His achievements were most notable because the empire had been ravaged by a bubonic outbreak that reached Byzantium from Ethiopia in 541 and killed up to a third of the population. The plague re-emerged over a 15-year period and weakened the empire, forcing it on the defensive. After 602, a successful rebellion ousted the Emperor Maurice, a successful general who had claimed important victories against the Persian Sassanid Empire, against the Slavs, the Avars, and the Lombards of Italy. However, the triumphs exacted a high cost and forced Maurice to increase taxes. A military coup led by an ambitious junior officer in the army inspired a civilian revolt in Constantinople. Seeing an opportunity for a quick victory against their old enemy, the Persians invaded Egypt and Syria. By 626, Constantinople was besieged, and the empire was in mortal danger. It was the efforts of Emperor Heraclius that averted the danger. He ordered an invasion of Persian lands, which forced the Sassanids to abandon their campaigns in Syria and Egypt. Yet again, the empire had survived. However, a new power was on the move, emerging from the deserts of Arabia, and a new conflict would begin, and it would define an era. Two of the world's greatest religions were about to discover the other. History would never be the same again. Until next time, thank you for listening.